Hi, I'm Sohrab Ahmari, and I want to thank the Napa Institute for asking me to participate in this important seminar. My talk will be about the Catholic antidote to woke capital. It assumes that woke capital is a problem for Catholics, be they workers or business owners, um, and suggests that there are Catholic ways to address that problem. So to begin, I want to quote the journalist Chris Caldwell. In 2017, he wrote, we may have done nothing for the poor, but we did appoint the first disabled lesbian parking commissioner. That's how he summarized the attitude of left liberal elites, as I said, in 2017, in what I consider to be one of the most insightful and far-seeing pieces of journalism of the new century. It appeared in the magazine City Journal. Caldwell was writing specifically about France and its social divides between a working class eking out an increasingly precarious existence outside the country's opportunity-rich cores, urban cores, and the beneficiaries of the new economy, upwardly mobile urbanites, as he put it, the old bourgeoisie, as well as the new creative class, people generally under the impression that their success in life has nothing to do with specific political, cultural, and economic arrangements that may have come at the expense of other people. I call that class the neoliberal class. Quote, wrote Caldwell, never have conditions been more favorable for deluding a class of fortunate people into thinking that they owe their privilege to being nicer or smarter or more honest than everyone else. End quote. Meanwhile, the suffering and the aspirations of the working class, of the median Frenchman, as Caldwell put it, aren't even on the radar of the neoliberal class. How could it be otherwise? The elites associate almost exclusively with their own socioeconomic and cultural peers, the one exception being the largely immigrant population that services their quotidian needs: nannies, dry cleaners, Uber drivers, fresh direct delivery men. As Caldwell wrote, those outside the city gates in peripheral France are invisible, their wishes incomprehensible. It's as if they don't exist. End quote. The neoliberal class barely notices that this other country, working and middle class France, is, quote, failing not just in income and longevity, but also in family formation, mental health, and education. Much like the working and middle class America meticulously documented and analyzed by Charles Murray in his book of a few years ago, Coming Apart. Ignored, too, is the fact that the working middle has lost its political voice. Quote, fewer than 2% of legislators in France's National Assembly today come from the working class, as opposed to 20% just after World War II. Again, there's an American analog. Increasingly, people who are lawmakers of both parties tend to be from the elite and not representative of the old working class as a political class. Of course, any social, political, and cultural arrangement needs a legitimating ideology and a disciplinary mechanism for those who fall out of line. So the phenomenon lately termed woke capitalism, I argue, is precisely that. Caldwell got to the very essence of it with that quip. We may have done nothing for the poor, but we did appoint the first disabled lesbian parking commissioner. The American version of that might read, and this is how I'd put it, we may have done nothing for you, former auto parts worker who once had decent wages and health insurance, but is now barely surviving on 2 different itinerant gigs. But hey, at least your HR manager is a trans woman. And by the way, you better learn to address her with the right pronouns, or else. Caldwell thought that woke capitalism, or woke bureaucracy, mainly promotes redistribution among, not from, elites. The members of the neoliberal class itself, after all, face intense competition from an early age. One way to defenestrate rivals is to accuse them of insufficient allegiance to the latest race, gender, and sexuality nostrums. But I'd say that woke capitalism does 2 further things. It also adds a patina of justice to what is otherwise a brutal, hyper-competitive system. Amazon workers might be forced to relieve themselves in bottles because they aren't given breaks, sufficient breaks, But hey, at least the firm puts a rainbow flag on its logo for Pride Month. To whatever hygiene and productivity requirements Kroger employees are subject to is now added a new ideological one. The supermarket chain recently fired employees who refused to wear Pride insignia at work. And those employees, we just recently learned, are suing on the basis of discrimination. Woke capitalism also serves as a political disciplinary mechanism against the working class. This is why I cringe whenever I hear fellow conservatives talk about wokeness as a socialist plot to subvert the entire American establishment. Quite the contrary. The entire American establishment, Walmart, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, the trustees of Ivy League universities, the major sports leagues, even Brooks Brothers, for God's sake, line up behind wokeness. Would they do that if wokeness threatened their concrete material interests? Of course not. And yet these and many other firms and institutions are falling over themselves to express solidarity with the uprising, some going so far as to donate millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, an outfit that until recently listed among its objectives the abolition of the nuclear family. But wait, riots and statue toppling, such things aren't congenial to establishment figures, are they? Maybe, but for all its fury, the storm of the riots of the summer ended. And through it all, there was little resembling demands for ongoing redistributive justice of the kind the old left championed. No labor solidarity, nothing to do with wages and job security, just demands for quote-unquote representation or diversity on corporate boards, in university curricula, and so on. And of course, the firing of those who say the wrong or awkward thing in the digital public square, in workplaces or in classrooms. So why is the neoliberal class supporting what seems to be a revolution against the current order? Well, I would suggest that what we saw over the summer and its reverberations in the corporate boardrooms and in marketing and public relations efforts of various companies wasn't in fact a revolution. It was a counter-revolution. About 4 years ago, we had the real uprising, which I would argue was the populist upsurge represented on the two sides of the Atlantic, President Trump's election in the United States, and then earlier that summer in 2016, the British vote to exit the European Union. For the first time in a long time, the sort of people who had acquired position and influence as a result of globalization were turfed out of power. And they watched in horror as voters chose, as I said, Brexit, Trump, and elsewhere in the developed world, various populist parties that seemed to have a different message. They insisted on the importance of job security at home. They weren't happy about the transformations wrought by open borders. They weren't happy about some of the cultural agenda of the neoliberal class. So the fact that they were deposed, I think, explains the storm of unrest that battered American cities from coast to coast, and it made some waves in Europe as well. When, as I said, when national institutions bow or kneel to street fighters' demands, it should tell us that something else is going on. We're dealing with a Maoist or Marxist revolt, even if some protagonists spout hard leftish rhetoric. Rather, what's playing out is a counter-revolution of the neoliberal class, academia, media, large corporations, quote-unquote experts, big tech, against that earlier nationalist revolution launched in 2016. The supposed insurgents and elites marched together in the streets, and they took the knee together. And they don't seek a radically new arrangement. They want a return to the pre-Trump, pre-Brexit, pre-populist status quo ante that was working out very well for them. It was, of course, working out less well for the working class of all races, as we said. They bore the brunt of the preferred policy mix of the neoliberal class: open borders, free trade without limits, and aggressive cultural liberalism that corroded tradition and community, technocratic global governance that neutered democracy and really politics as such. So conservatives and Christian conservatives don't generally pay attention to class analysis, but in this case, I do believe it helps explain what's going on. And it also helps to illuminate the nature of social movements that can pose as and can get easily mistaken for revolutionary leftism. Again, the goal in these cases is rarely to rectify things like wealth inequality or health and job insecurity, but rather the opposite. The goal is to mitigate, to defer, to smooth over, to mask these substantive disagreements, and instead have battles on procedural mechanisms for upholding manners. Ultimately, wokeness is a kind of new ethos, a new set of mores and manners. And which social class excels most at politically correct manners? Well, of course, that would be the professional managerial class, the laptop class, the neoliberal class we've been talking about. Their children learn the patois for discussing issues of race, gender, and sexuality from a very early age. They're expected to have mastered it by the time they take their entry-level jobs, just like they're expected to know how to use chopsticks. It's a mark of your social class. It's a skill that private schools are doubtless teaching already. Working class people, by contrast, are most likely to struggle with this new language. Even when they mean well, they don't always get it right, not least because the rules constantly shift with the vagaries of critical race theory and LGBTQ acronyms. So by fortifying the requirements to speak and think correctly and raising the stakes for failure, the neoliberal class has now built a new repressive mechanism for staying on top of and keeping down the oiks, especially those who voted the wrong way in 2016. So what should Christians, not least Christian business people, champion in the face of these forces? What's the antidote to woke capitalism? The answer seems obvious to me. When dealing with a mirage of something, there is no more powerful counterforce than reality, than the real thing. In this case, we have a mirage of social justice. The best counter to it is the real thing. Catholic social thought, as articulated first by Pope Leo XIII in his great encyclical Rerum Novarum, and then developed by his successors across numerous key encyclicals. You, as attendees and friends of the Napa Institute, need no introduction to this body of teaching. But if I were to summarize it very briefly, or perhaps to distill its most important insight for our time, it would be this: that the political community exists to make men better, as Pope Leo said, by promoting the common good of all, with an eye ultimately to the spiritual common good. Economic life is one central facet of that, which means that the economy doesn't exist for its own sake. The free market is a good and efficient way to allocate goods, services, and capital, but it isn't some autonomous thing with a mind of its own, divorced from the moral and political imperatives of the political community. The common good must be the shared task of the whole political community, and that necessarily implies ties of mutual obligation between different classes. Senator Marco Rubio recently picked up on these themes at a recent speech at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Explicitly citing the Leonine teaching, the senator said he envisioned an economy in which, quote, workers and businesses are not competitors for their share of limited resources, but instead partners in an effort that benefits both and strengthens the entire nation. At its most prosperous, America boasted just such an economy. More recently, Rubio lamented, we have become defenders of the right of businesses to make a profit, the right of shareholders to receive a return on their investment, and the obligation of people have to work, which is all fine. But, quote, we have neglected the rights of workers to share in the benefits they create for their employer, and the obligation of businesses to act in the best interests of the workers and the country that have made their success possible, end quote. Meanwhile, though we know you normally associate, quote unquote, the left with the rights of workers, as I've noted, that increasingly is not the case. The left nowadays is most concerned with redistribution among elites, per Caldwell. It is obsessed with the concerns and preferences of the urban professional managerial class, not the broad working and middle classes. The result, as Rubio said, is, quote, an economy whose architecture has been rapidly and dramatically transformed, and an economy and a society no one is happy with, end quote. There's a fundamental insecurity to American life, my friends, that is a source of tremendous anxiety and that hinders the things that Christian entrepreneurs, I would hope very much included, care about: family formation, total fertility, social cohesion, etc., etc. It's not enough to say, well, we need the church to be stronger, or we need to evangelize the culture. Of course, all those things are true, but it would be a great denial of everything classical and Christian philosophy teach us to stop right there. Because, of course, our political and economic arrangements are architectonic to every other human activity and everything else we do. If Leo was right, and I very much believe he was, then to make men and women better, we need a just society. We need social justice rightly understood, rather than the poisonous imposter we get under the banner of social justice today. Woke capitalism seeks to divide us. It worsens all of our social antagonisms. It makes people feel alone. It does not bring them together. It punishes and disciplines without actually teaching anything good. But the answer isn't to insist on atomized individualism. It's to build a common good capitalism. Thank you very much.